Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. You can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 147 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on the psychology of voting and part 1. So with the next 2 podcast episodes, with the first one being today, obviously, and then the other one will be on Thursday, is that we're going to be looking at the different factors that can affect voting behaviour. And I have to admit, this is just flat out fascinating. I really enjoyed this, because there's so many different facets. And whilst I definitely admit some of the research, you can tell it's correlational. And to be honest, I think some of them are a bit of a weak correlation, but they're still really, really interesting to read about. And the factors that I've included in these next 2 podcast episodes are definitely the more scientifically grounded ones. So really interesting stuff though that you're going to love. And also though, I do just want to quickly apologise for the slightly poorer quality audio in the last podcast episode though, because what happened was that the software that I use to record and edit the podcast updated without me knowing, and basically the function that I use to get rid of background noise is that it got a lot more powerful. So I ran it normal, normal though, and that took out some of my own voice. Some interesting stuff. Yes, and the pains of editing audio. And it is the 29th of April 2022 as I record this. So we're moving on to the psychology news section. We're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one is, background noise can make us less cautious. Background noise is the feature of most people's everyday lives, whether it's driving, at the gym, at home, or even at work. We often have music playing whilst we're doing something else. Research into precisely how this affects our behaviour, emotions and cognitive processes has provided mixed findings. However, one of the reasons, argue Augustus Prin Sangilardo, probably butchered that, at the University of Buenos Aires and their colleagues, is that there are so many variables, both in terms of the type of music used in the studies and also the aspects of performance being measured. So it's no wonder that the results have been inconsistent. Sangilardo's team had decided, therefore, to explore changes in one music variable, tempo, and to look on the effects of 2 individual aspects of decision-making, speed and accuracy. And they report in their paper that background music indeed have an effect. It made the participants less cautious. So that I think is a really interesting finding there, but because I also have background music on different bits that were and whilst I'm doing different activities. And I can really understand this though, because I don't have a background music on if I'm doing a certain activities that actually requires me to focus. Though, if I'm doing email, if I'm submitting something etc. Those tasks where I need to concentrate, I don't have background music on though, because I tend to find that it does affect a performance. Or the worst thing though is that when you're listening to a song lyric, whilst you're typing an email, and then instead of typing out the email, you start typing out the song lyrics. Yes, that's definitely bad though, but interesting. So the second one is, extroverts are considered to be poor listeners. Extroverts are hugely sociable. They really care about their relationships and possess outstanding social skills. Well, that's how extroverts are generally portrayed, but according to new work, that's not exactly how other people see them. In a series of studies reported in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, Francis J. Flynn at Stanford University and their colleagues consistently found that more extroverted people are considered to be poorer listeners. The research also reveals a likely reason why though, so I won't click onto it per se though, but I would just say the biggest thing to take away from this psychology news section is just, try and be active listener, and whenever you're talking to someone, just focus on them, listen, and yes, and even if they're being really boring, just nod your head, repeat what they say every so often, just so they know whether actually and etc. Seeing that good people do bad things makes the world feel like a confusing place. Have you ever believed someone to be decent, but then they did something morally bad, which turned that belief on its head? It happens more often than we might think, And according to a new work, the consequences are far-reaching. In 2 initial studies, online participants who reported having this type of experience gave the details about the event and the perpetrator before answering a series of questions about how they felt before, during, and after it happened. These questions probed their perceptions of the perpetrator's character, their general beliefs around the world and other people, and their confidence in their ability to judge character. The results suggest that the experience of a good person doing something immoral is so unsettling. It makes us doubt our ability to judge character, and also makes the world feel like a more confusing place. Yeah, I completely agree, because we all like to think that we know good people, and they are, and that's that. Good people are good people, bad people are bad people. There's no in between. But of course, we know that there is a massive overlap there. But everyone likes to believe that the world is certainty. And I forget the exact social psychology principle, but I know it's something like world certainty, or I don't know really, but I know that there's a concept that this all relates to. So interesting. And yeah, it is very unsettling to see when you thought that a good person does something wrong though. So interesting and very unsettling. So that's it for the psychology news section. So let's move on to the person update. So we're moving on to the personal update. This week was definitely a lot more of a psychology focused week compared to other weeks though, because for 2 main reasons. So the first one is that I've firstly because I've really been chipping away, and I've really been getting back into the full swing of this literature review that I'm doing for my psychology placement. And considering that I've never done a literature review from scratch before though, I'm actually really pleased with how it's going. But I will admit, I'm not exactly sure how academic it's been written though, because I do struggle with academic writing, as I've mentioned before on the podcast, and I think it's a lot better than my academic writing was a year ago, but it's nowhere near perfect though. So I will definitely learn a lot when I finish it, and when I get the improvements and suggestions from my placement of people though. So interesting. And it's actually quite a lot of fun to actually do with this literature though, because you would get to look at the research, make your points, and think all that. So I am enjoying it. And the second reason why this week has been a lot more psychology based is because I've decided to really research other careers in psychology post, because I've been meaning to tell all of you this for ages, and I'm sure that the vast majority of you have figured it out based on this month's topics. But I know I said earlier in the year that I was going to focus on the psychology of suicide, careers, and dementia, but I sort of just threw that against the wall end of March, because I noticed that the podcast numbers were slightly down, and I really do understand that, simply because ever since the vast majority of you have been listening to the podcast, though, we've looked at a really massive range of topics, and to be honest, that's why I love the podcast, and it's also probably why most of you love it. So thank you. But the problem with having 3 focused areas is that it only gave us 1 episode a month where we could actually look at something else though. So that I've scrapped, and that's why I'll be going back to the normal schedule. Well, I do find some research. I just find a topic that I like each week, and then I do a podcast episode, and I really am enjoying it. But this week I was really focusing on careers in psychology, and this is more of an introductory book that were from my perspective of about all of the different career options though, because I was researching it, and especially when it comes business psychology, I had no idea that was a possible career option though. So it's really, really interesting. And then I also look at some academia bits though. So I really am looking forward to researching this and writing it up, and then I'll put it out at some point. And always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment on the show notes. Sorry about that word thing. At connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi Whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you, because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by Social Psychology, a guide to social and psychology. I almost forgot what the book was called. So back to the professional bit. So, but the reason why this is such a great sponsor for today's episode is because political psychology really does draw on social psychology. Because political psychology really does depend on our group processes, our own self-identity, and so many more great social psychology topics. So if you want a great, really easy to understand and really engaging book about social psychology, just you can understand the political psychology aspects even more, then please check out Social Psychology, a guide to social and cultural psychology, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon at your local bookstore and local library if you request it. And if you didn't want to buy a book but you're still willing to give the podcast a bit of one-time support, then you can now buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Conor Whiteley. So let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be looking at the psychology of voting, part 1. And the reason why I actually wanted to do this a particular podcast episode of this week is because the UK has some upcoming local elections. So I thought that it would be fun to see why do people vote as they do. Because of course, all of us, we all tend to think that we vote because of some sound logic that because we might vote for our own family or our own self-interest, the good of the country, amongst a few other so-called logical reasons. And the reason why I call these so-called is because we actually don't vote that logically always, because there are so many really interesting factors and that's what we're going to look at. And I also just want to note quickly is of course, even though this is a political psychology podcast episode, besides from the information shared here, this episode will contain no references to politics, like my own preferences. So, what are the 4 factors that we're going to look at today? The first one is the polling station. So, I thought that it would be great to start off this episode with a very strange factor that affects our voting behaviour. Well, this is strange to me because I always do postal voting, because come on, because I just do not have the time to go down to the polling station. I really believe in democracy and voting, but not enough to go down the polling station. Anyway, it turns out that there's a growing amount of evidence that suggests that the very places where people go to vote affects their voting, as supported by Brusca, Meredith and Wheeler 2008. And I also just want to note that because this podcast episode just contain so many references, I'm actually not going to name the studies there. But if you were interested in actually finding out about these studies, then please just go to conorwhiteley.net/podcast, find episode 147, and then the references will be at the very bottom. Okay, so this study found that when a person voted in a school, they were more likely to back a candidate that wanted to fund education. Equally, Rushik 2010 found when a polling station was in a church, then people were more likely to vote for a conservative candidate. Personally, I just think that it's amazing how these polling station locations can actually act as some sort of primer for a specific behaviour. And of course, I think if a politician was actually behind that, I think that could just be such a clever way to gain an advantage. Unethical, but clever. However, sometimes these priming effects aren't always so predictable, since one study from 2014 found that even though people were voting in a church, and this was regardless of the religious symbols around them, these voters still were expressed support for same-sex marriage, regardless of the religious arguments made against it. And of course, sometimes in psychology, you do just get some flat-out weird results. For example, a study from 2010 found that if people were leaning to the left because of a missing wheel on a wheelchair, for example, then these people were more likely to vote and sympathise with left-wing politics, and vice versa for people leaning to the left. Well, I can really see how some of these results are just correlational, and that's what most of these factors are. So we can't get causation from most of these studies. However, you have to admit they do make for pretty interesting reading, regardless of how weird they sound. Candidates' appearance. So for the next factor, I thought that we would come down to earth for a moment though, because the candidate's appearance is a clear factor that would impact voting behaviour. And you only need to do psychology of our relationships and social psychology to see the interesting and rather bizarre effects that beauty can have on people. In addition, lots of people are swayed to vote based on a person's looks. Since a 2009 study asked Swiss students to rate two unfamiliar French political candidates to see who they believed was more competent, and the results found that students found the candidate with the most real-life success as most competent, leading the researchers to suggest that those in real life had also been swayed by their good looks. Also, and this one I thought was quite interesting, was that a study from 2012 found that voters are more likely to prefer male and female candidates with deeper voices. I have no idea why. Just because it's just voices. Unless high-pitched voices are sort of associated with less incompetent people. Or the awful stereotype of the dumb blonde, which is just a disgraceful stereotype. As well as, whilst obesity is a disadvantage for women, it can actually help male candidates get voted in, and that was from a study in 2012. That, I think, is just strange, because that's just double standard. Finally, people who are ignorant of politics are much more swayed by a politician's appearance compared to those who are more informed about politics. And this is even more true if the politician has plenty of TV exposure. Candidate personality. Interestingly enough, personality can be a massive factor that affects how we vote, and I understand this because we want our leaders to have a so-called good personality with a desirable trait, since our personality traits do affect how we behave, and it is ultimately how our politicians behave that affect our lives. Therefore, it is strange that the media and the journalists often get attacked for focusing too much on a candidate's personality and not the big issues of the time. Nonetheless, there is a good amount of evidence to suggest that a candidate's perceived personality traits are relevant and do play an active role in the way we vote. For example, several studies, including one from 2011, found people are more likely to vote for a candidate who has a similar personality to them, and then another study from 2014 found students are more likely to vote for candidates who are more open-minded, friendly and emotionally stable. And what I find really interesting about this particular study was the politicians' extroversion and conscientiousness traits were not related to the students voting in attentions, meaning that all personality traits are not equal when it comes to voting. Overall, personality can definitely impact our behaviour because at different topics from social psychology, like a group and a relationship, apport to the idea that we prefer people who are similar to us. So it makes sense that this applies to politics and our own voting and behaviour. Voter emotions. As evidence from cognitive psychology shows, our thinking processes are affected by our own emotions, and this most certainly applies to politics too, since when we are happy, we tend to vote for the ruling party. In addition, a study from 2017, 2010 and 2008 showed that when people are happy, they still tend to vote for the ruling party, and they don't tend to focus on the details of the candidates. But when we're fearful, people focus more on the details of the individual candidates and scrutinise them. For example, researcher from Israel has shown that living in fear of a rocket attacks increases support for right-wing parties. But on the flip side, there's evidence that terrorist attacks in Madrid led to an increase in the country's left-wing opposition parties in the election that came just days later. And that was a study from 2011. Therefore, I think that this is another powerful reminder that we mustn't forget the power of our emotions to affect how we think, behave and make decisions, since clearly making a decision on how we vote is not as singular or unitary of a decision as people believe, because there are just so many factors that affect it. Conclusion. So as we can see from this podcast episode, people don't just make their political decisions based on sound logic. There are so many different factors that can make someone vote in a certain way. And even though some of this sounds concerning at the very least, it is that potential concern that makes it so interesting to study, look at and talk about. There are three more factors that we'll look at in the next political psychology episode, and that I really am looking forward to. They're just great. And I do actually have to admit that it's actually really nice to change a bit of a political discussion from what's going on to why is it going on in the first place. So personally, I feel like this is a bit of like fresh air compared to the politics that the media reports on. Do you agree? So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and hope that you got a lot out of it. Personally, I really did enjoy it, and I really am looking forward to Thursday's podcast episode that you'll hear about. And if you know someone who would enjoy today's episode, then please tell them about it. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And definitely check out Social Psychology, a guide to social and cultural psychology, 3rd edition, available in all of the usual places. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.